Yo, what's up? Let's talk about some recent developments in Mythic Plus and like how the season's been going. We'll talk about how hard the dungeons are, how easy they are. My last video that I released was I think about the patch notes, but the video before that was talking about the ease of pugging dungeons. I think that was fairly accurate. They ended up nerfing Priority of the Sacred Flame and Operation Bloodgate since then, but players are doing 15s plus 15s on live. Of course, early season pushing isn't always like super indicative of what exactly is going on at the season itself, but I think that we can actually kind of start to see some of the trends with some of the specializations that people are playing, some of the compositions that people are playing, what dungeons are easy versus hard, because we have some data on all of that kind of stuff, and we can just kind of take a way too early look at what's going on at the Plus. So, as it currently stands, a lot of these graphs are going to be on Raider.io. There's some data that we're going to be using from Mythic Stats and just kind of talking about like what's actually in the meta and whatnot. A lot of the data is available on Raider.io though. So, first off, we can see the spec popularity. We're starting to see some trends as the keys get higher. Whenever you reach around the 10 mark, you can see that the meta is pretty diverse with what people are playing. People are playing a lot of different stuff. Just in general, of course, it really just kind of comes down to, early on in the season, nobody really cares about who they invite, right? They're just inviting the most qualified people, maybe people who've already done that dungeon on 10, people who are super geared. And then as the season progresses, people become way more weird about making sure that you're constantly playing meta specialization. So, I mean, in 10s here, you see Disc Priest make up 7.8%, whereas, Disc Priest looks like it's going to be a very good healer, and so in 15s, it makes up 13.7% of the data that we're seeing. Same with Fire Mage, as the keys go higher, the meta starts to condense a little bit, and you can also see that on mythicstats.com, where this is the top 2,000 plus runs by key each week, and we're immediately starting off, and it's actually not too bad. Only 43% of runs are Discipline Priest. Restoration Shaman and Mistweaver Monk in the top 2,000 runs are actually making up an okay amount of representation. Vengeance and Paladin are both splitting about 50-50. If you actually look at the highest level keys, it looks like Bear Druid and Protection Warrior are both also seeing some representation in those max level keys, so 15s. I actually think that the tank meta is going to be a little bit closer than we initially thought, particularly because Protection Warrior does so much damage. Protection Warrior in some instances can even out DPS players on single target. So it does a lot of damage. I wouldn't be shocked to see if the meta kind of develops into a lot of people playing with a Prot Warrior, where Vengeance, I think, is well regarded as a more tanky option. Paladin has a lot of utility for the group, and so whenever you start to run into one-shots or you actually need the help from the Paladin, particularly for your Disc Priest, Paladin is also very good. For DPS, it's kind of all up in the air. A lot of the top 2,000 runs involve a Ret Paladin, but that's just because Ret Paladin's super popular, not necessarily because it's going to see long-term a lot of play, although I don't think that Ret Paladin's necessarily bad. I just don't think it's going to end up being as popular as it is currently, right? And I mean, you can already start to see that whenever we're starting to look at the front page. A couple of these have Ret Paladin. Some of these actually are playing 2 Ret Paladins, but not all of them. Not even most of them even have 1 Ret Paladin. So I think that the meta is going to kind of condense down a little bit for DPS. But there's a lot of good specializations. I think there's probably somewhere in the order of like 7, 8, 9 DPS that are going to be actually quite strong, and you're going to see some level of representation. A lot of this comes down to Augavoker, though, right? Augavoker no longer being in the meta allows a lot more diverse compositional layouts whenever you're actually starting to pick your comp, because you're not starting with one specialization that's like super OP, and then you're putting an Augavoker into it because you want to make them even more OP. Now, let's take a step to kind of look at some of the dungeons. Yeah, I think I said everything I wanted to about DPS specializations. I mean, you can see it laid out in kind of a different fashion as well here, where Mythic Plus spec popularity, and whenever I select 12 and up, you see DPS, it's Ret Paladin, it's Moonkin, it's Fire Mage. Ellie Shaman's actually starting to get popular as well. Enhances, of course, pretty good. Unholy DK, BM Hunter, Havoc Demon Hunter. Not super surprising stuff. Seeing in play from the DPS perspective, Vintage Demon Hunter and Disc Priest being the most popular tank and healer, but Mr. and Prot Paladin not too far behind. So it's kind of a wait and see thing with the meta for specializations, but you're starting to see some early trends forming. Now, let's look at the dungeons. So looking at the dungeons for all Mythic Plus levels, I think the only real way that you can tell roughly, how hard each dungeon is by looking at depletion rate, right? Or in time percentage, where you see Operation Floodgate and Prior to Sacred Flame, even though these dungeons got nerfed, they're still the hardest dungeons to time. Now, obviously, the easiest dungeons to time are Darkflame Cleft and the Rookery, which is actually not super surprising. I think it's maybe a little bit more surprising because Theater of Pain, people have actually faced a dungeon before, so in theory, it shouldn't be too bad. But Rookery and Darkflame Cleft actually have very lenient timers, just in general, and the mobs aren't like super punishing in either of these dungeons. I actually think the Rookery bosses telegraph pretty well, and after you see that dungeon one time, it actually becomes a lot easier. Now, if you start to sort by 12 and up, things start to get to even more exacerbated, where Prior to the Sacred Flame in time percent drops all the way down to 45.9%, where a dungeon like Darkflame Cleft is up at 85%. Again, Darkflame Cleft's timer, very, very generous. So if you actually start to try to do a Darkflame Cleft on a 12 or higher, it's not always going to be that challenging, whereas a Priory of the Sacred Flame, you basically need people who played on the PTR. So it's a little bit of a different experience for sure. Also, the Priory of the Sacred Flame timer is not that generous. Another dungeon that's like pretty high on the in percentage is actually Motherlode. A lot of people have started to recognize that the first area of Motherlode sucks, so they're skipping it, right? They're even jumping over the wall. They're doing a lot of potential skips in this dungeon to avoid pulling as many Peacekeepers as possible, and then as a result, pulling a lot of trash in the second and third area to be able to kind of make up that count. Rookery has the highest total runs on, and they actually have an okay in-time percentage. Of course, it's not as good as Darkflame Cleft. It's nowhere near as good as Darkflame Cleft or the Motherlode, but having a high amount of total runs with actually a decent in-time percentage, especially for early on in the season, isn't too bad. Anything north of around 55 to 60-ish%, I would say is like a kind of a fair dungeon, especially for high key pushing, which makes it kind of funny that Operation Floodgate has that 56-ish% mark. Whenever it has this 56-ish% mark, but it's really bad for all keys, this kind of implies that it's really bad for pugs and has a lot of areas which is difficult for pugs, meaning that you need to have like a pre-existing amount of knowledge before you actually go into that dungeon. Holding W is not necessarily an effective strategy in Operation Floodgate, and the timer's not super free, so the more that you know about that dungeon, the easier it kind of becomes. As the season went on, we saw for dungeons, the levels kind of normalized a little bit, but there was still the hardest dungeon according to this stat, like the in-time percentage that we were kind of looking at last season, was Grim Batol. I think everybody would agree. Grim Batol was by far the hardest dungeon. And the easiest dungeon, of course, was Arakawa. I think if you even sort by 16 and up, kind of similar feat being seen here, where Grim Batol had a 71% in-time ratio, and Arakawa had a 93% at 16 and up. Of course, this does not count abandoned runs. Early on, players are far more likely to fully complete a run instead of abandoning it. Now, obviously, this is going to end up skewing the data a little bit, but I think you can start to see some general trends as to how hard the dungeons are. I think that looking at number of completions as well is also something that is pretty valuable. You can actually start to see what's going on and just how the data is shaking up, how the specs are shaking up, and how dungeons are looking so far. Overall, though, I've actually been having a lot of fun playing this season. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts, and if you guys have any suggestions for additional videos that you want to see, leave them down in the comment section, and I'll be back in the next video. Goodbye.